Okay, I think that we're ready to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the session, Police Unions Prioritizing Citizens' Rights, Police Rights, Collective Bargaining Practices. My name is Marsha Connor. I'm the Executive Director of the National Forum for Black Public Administrators. I'd like to thank Noble for the opportunity to be with you today and moderate this session. Quite a lively session. We're looking forward to the discussion today. Want you to be able to join in as well. For the next hour and a half, we will cover many topics regarding citizens' rights, law enforcement rights, and collective bargaining practices. We will entertain questions from our panel. At the end, we'll allow you the opportunity through the chat to also ask questions. At this time, what I'd like to do is to introduce our sponsors for today's session, as well as the conference. We have our first is Derek Benner, who is with Thomson Reuters, who will bring us greetings.
Thank you, Ms. Connor. Appreciate the introduction, and it's great to be here today, and especially with our noble partners and friends. Thomson Reuters is always proud to join Noble and these events, and particularly today's series and some of these really excellent discussions that are happening throughout the day. Law enforcement professionals, law enforcement leaders, community partners, and industry partners. Bit of background: I retired in January as the Director of Homeland Security Investigations, and my former organization is no stranger to several of these issues being discussed today, and with our panel of subject matter experts. And I'm excited to join as this issue is certainly not going away. We are probably only at the beginning of a significant period of change that will continue to shape our profession over the coming years. And this is an issue that I think we've seen Congress and state legislators, city councils dealing with this year, next year, and for the foreseeable future. Clearly, the challenges are complex, and there's no shortage of ideas on how to improve relationships within our organizations relative to bargaining units and leadership, and then more broadly, justice and accountability and trust. It's important, I think, to remember that law enforcement is just one part of the overall justice system. And I think people acknowledge that each component of the overall system is in need of modernization and improvement as well. But because of that complexity, it's more important that all the appropriate stakeholders, and I mean all of our partners are at the table and driving constructive ideas for reform. And this includes our communities, our educational systems, our industry and business leaders, and organizations across the spectrum that have good ideas. But most importantly, from my perspective as a former law enforcement officer, the most important folks to be there are the law enforcement practitioners. Any change in policing policy ultimately impacts police officers on the front lines as much or more than anyone else. It affects how they can do their jobs. It affects their personal safety. And we lay so much at the feet of our nation's law enforcement professionals. We don't give them all the resources many times and the support they need to do it all, and we ask so much of them. Most police professionals we talk to in our industry agree with that. The voice of their experience is essential in this. And that's why Noble has an indispensable role to play as well. One thing that I lived by as a leader in a law enforcement organization was the best ideas come from the front lines where the people are doing the work every day. And opening up that pathway from the front lines with all the relevant people at the table is how we get better. So I look forward to the discussion today. Certainly a challenge for everybody involved to understand how to balance the impact and the changes in policy and how how that affects rank and file, law enforcement, our presence in our communities, and our leadership as well. When I started to think about today and today's panel, I couldn't help but think that I wish I'd had the benefit of this event and this expertise a couple of years ago, because it certainly would have helped me in my old job as well. So again, welcome everybody. Thank you on behalf of Thomson Reuters for joining us today and allowing us to be part of it. Thank you, Ms. Connor.
You're welcome. Derek, we really thank you, and we thank Thomson Reuters. We know that our events and associations and the support that you give to law enforcement across this country is important. And through our sponsors, we're able to put on sessions like this for many of the members of Noble. And so it's really important to have that support, and we certainly appreciate that. Thank you again for joining us today. We will now have a video by our sponsor, Verizon, who is a sponsor of not only the conference, but today's session.
Public safety needs to know that Verizon has their back. Our public safety customers have come to depend on the coverage, the reliability, the capacity on that network. Nowhere else does better matter more than serving our public safety and first responder community.
Supporting public safety and those who support our communities is part of our DNA. And we believe that helping to restore communications is vitally important in helping to restore normalcy to our communities.
Verizon has a crisis response team available 24/7 to ensure law enforcement and public safety have the network access and support that they need.
Public safety officials run to a crisis. Verizon runs to a crisis.
Reliable communications is the key, and we know that the Verizon response team is always available to us to make sure that we have the communications we need without any interruption.
We don't begin thinking about network reliability when an emergency happens. We prepare year-round. We engage in disaster recovery drills internally and hold live crisis response exercises alongside first responders.
We can bring cows, cell on wheels, Colts, cells on a light truck, Spots, satellite pico cell on a trailer. We can also bring mobile command centers and Big Red. All of those assets are designed to keep first responders connected 24/7 so they can complete their mission.
Their ability to respond instantly and get us that ability so quickly, that's very reassuring to a police chief.
The Verizon Theater is the cornerstone of the museum. We start the visitor's experience in the Verizon Theater, and from there, they leave and experience the rest of the museum. It is because of Verizon that we are able to accomplish our mission every day.
A national organization of Black law enforcement executives, Noble, is all about justice by action. And our ultimate goal is to ensure that everyone feels equally protected under the law. Verizon's partnership provides resources, assistance, and technologies that enable Noble and a profession to protect and serve communities across this country.
We also support the families of the fallen officers through the Verizon Fallen Officer Fund. And this helps them get through the initial hurdles of dealing with such a personal tragedy.
Verizon cares about law enforcement who are putting their lives on the line to keep us safe every day.
Just demonstrates that Verizon's a company with a heart and that they care about first responders.
We have the dedicated people, the resources, and the partner ecosystem to serve public safety now and well into the future.
It's a smile on everyone's face when you can pick up the phone and everything works.
I want to say to the audience, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, Thomson Reuters and Verizon. And if you get a moment, send a shout out to them in the exhibit area. And if you see any representatives from Verizon or from Thomson Reuters, take a moment, have a conversation, thank them for the work and the support that they provide to Noble. And thank you for joining us. So let's do a shout out. You can put something in the chat to them or not, but it's time for us to get ready for the discussion for today that we're all excited about. I am Marsha Connor, the moderator. I am the executive director for NFBPA, but I came to this job through local government. I've been a budget director, an assistant city manager, and a city manager for cities, counties, and towns across the country. Interestingly enough, in all of my positions, I've had the opportunity to have the police department and public safety report directly to me. So I'm so glad today to be able here to moderate this conversation today. And I think we have some great panelists and we want all of you to just join in. At the end, we will again have the opportunity for you to put some questions in chat. But I'd like to start off by introducing our panelists. I'd first like to introduce Leonard Leachy. He's the principal of O'Malley, Miles, Nowlin, and Gilmore. Well known as a lobbyist in the Maryland area and also with the U.S. Congress. But one of the things I found interesting about him is that he's sat on both sides of the table of this conversation, representing not only city and county and local governments, but also representing unions and the Fraternal Order of the Police on issues in the areas of collective bargaining. So I'd like for him to take an opportunity when the time comes to introduce himself. We also have joining us today, Eric Carter. He is the first deputy superintendent for the Chicago Police Department, where he has served for over 29 years and will bring a wealth of experience and conversation today. We also have Danielle Outlaw, who is the commissioner for Philadelphia Police Department, who is joining us today. I know a little bit about her when she was the chief of police in Portland, worked with a very close friend of mine, but now she's at the helm of the Philadelphia Police Commissioner. She sits at the helm of the nation's 4th largest police department. Welcome. I believe that's all who have joined us so far. And I believe we have more panelists who will join us a little bit later. But I'd like for them, each one of them, to take a couple of minutes and give us some opening statements about not only themselves, but the challenges they have before them as it relates to collective bargaining and share their perspectives and views. So who shall we start with? Who would like to go first?
I can start.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's an honor to be on such an esteemed panel. I'm actually looking really forward to this conversation. I'll start off because, I've worked, so as mentioned, this is my 3rd police department, and I started in the Oakland Police Department and then, moved on to the Portland, Oregon Police Department as the chief there, and now here. Each department had a very strong union. And I want to point out that my very first time not being represented or a member of, a union was in 2017 when I took the job as police chief in Portland. So what I say, I want to make very clear in that I'm not anti-representation by any means, but I also understand that in leadership, especially when you take over as a new leader in a new department, especially when you're hired to be a change agent, there's certain things that you need to get done. And if there are previously negotiated contracts that have at some point negotiated away with traditionally our managerial rights, it could make what we're trying to implement as new leadership in a department with a very old and established culture pretty challenging. So right off the bat, I think I can say that some of the challenges with dealing with collective bargaining agreements that are already in place, depending on, when the next negotiation takes place, you're coming in to do new things. And it might be very difficult to do that when there are already established patterns and practices or just, agreements in place. So I'll leave that out there and let some of my other panelists kind of address, but I'm looking forward to how this dialogue unfolds.
I'll go next if that's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Danielle said, Chief Outlaw said, it's a pleasure to be a part of this esteemed panel and to even be able to speak here before you. For me, my 29 years in law enforcement, just as Danielle spoke, 14 years ago when I became an exempt member, I lost all of my bargaining rights. So I'm not represented by union representation, but prior to, we have the FOP, which represents our officers, and we have the PBPA, which represents the supervisors, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. So it's two separate bargaining units, but the sergeants, lieutenants, and captains have a Me Too clause that wherever the FOP gets, they're bound by whatever the FOP gets as well. So they get the same benefit. For us here in Chicago, we've only had collective bargaining for the officers since about 1983. So we're about almost 40 years into collective bargaining. But the challenges that we face mainly here in Chicago that I have to worry about as the day-to-day operational leader for the department is just worrying about movement of personnel, management of personnel, assignments. Collective bargaining takes care of negotiating salaries, medical benefits, things of that nature. But for me, I really have to manage the day-to-day operations. So that personnel movement is what's critical and key. The flexibility built into that contract, or being able to get that flexibility within the contract to allow for the department to be run properly is my day-to-day. Also, the next biggest thing is we're under a consent decree. So that consent decree has to be included in everything we look at contractually to make sure that we meet the requirements of the consent decree, but also the requirements that the officers need for their day-to-day benefits. So those are the challenges that are faced here in Chicago.
Okay. I think, Mr. Lucci, that leaves you.
All right, then. Thank you, Ms. Connor. As you mentioned, my experience has been on both sides. I've negotiated collective bargaining agreements on behalf of the Fraternal Order Police. I've negotiated collective bargaining agreements on behalf of local governments. I've been a chief of a county government office of law where we defended civil rights lawsuits and negotiated a consent decree with the U.S. Department of Justice. I've also represented the police unions with regard to departmental shootings and disciplinary matters. So I think I have a pretty balanced perspective, and I think that the key to all of this is balance. The pendulum I've seen swing too far in each direction, and it just, I think through a collaborative process between the two parties, you can achieve balance, but it takes collaboration to do that.
Okay. I think we're ready to go into our first question, since we sort of started right off with collective bargaining and talking about the bargaining practices. Is there a need to make change in this practice? Most of you, I think, have either participated, negotiated, or been under a collective bargaining agreement. And let's talk about the things you think are positive about the agreement, and then maybe some things given the environment of the last couple of years, what we've been challenged with over the last 18 months. Is it time to make some changes? And if this is the time, what type of changes would you like to see?
You want to go in reverse order? I could deal
Sure.
off with that. Okay.
Sure.
I think one thing that you need to be very careful about is the nature of binding arbitration with collective bargaining. The reason for binding arbitration, of course, is that public safety officers do not have the right to strike, and that's why many localities have adopted binding arbitration. But the way that is set up and the way that disputes are adjudicated and the way that, and what jurisdictions you look at for comparable jurisdictions, that's got to be looked at carefully, because it's possible for it to really run astray, and it's possible for it to be so restrained that it doesn't have any effect. So I think that process always needs to be revisited to make sure it really achieves the goals of all the parties, because it can be a real hammerlock on local government. And it can cause policy veering back and forth when the local elected officials don't get to make that policy.
Okay. So let's just do this. Whenever you want to jump in, let's sort of jump in there and do sort of a round robin between whoever starts first, and we'll go back and forth, because we really want to have a conversation about this, and as if we were sitting around the table talking about these issues. So Ms.
Trying to unmute myself.
Okay.
I think what was mentioned, those are some really, really good points that were covered. I just think about, not necessarily the process itself. I just think at some point when we go to the table, we actually just wrapped up our negotiations and it's now in the arbitrator's hands. And we're hoping to get a decision, sometime by early fall. But I think about, and I know, I don't think Carmen is necessarily in this particular session listening, but I think about my time in Portland. And, we were under consent decree there, then obviously leaving Oakland, very familiar with living and reporting to, living with and reporting to a federal monitor and a federal judge for over a decade, and I think we need to consider all of the factors, not just, what we consider managerial rights versus labor rights. I think about what happened in Seattle and how it had taken them years to get a contract. And then the federal judge, because they too were under a consent decree and they were so close, the federal judge said, you know what, you were in compliance, but now you're not, because the contract that you negotiated doesn't, and I'm paraphrasing, that's why I say Carmen's not here, she would clean this up for me, but the contract that you negotiated doesn't involve or account for community involvement or community input or community policing as much as it should. And so I think at some point, whether it's, on the side of labor, because obviously as police leadership, I'm not just thinking about the well-being and the interests of membership. I'm also thinking about community. I'm thinking about the best interests of the department. So it's a far more bird's eye peek into what I'm responsible for. But given that, I don't think there's that same consistency on the other side of the table and saying, well, yes, our membership is our rank and file here, but it's also, how are we incorporating the changing expectations of community as well? And, it's not an us versus them, but I would just hate to be, and, God willing, I'm knocking on wood, we're not under a federal consent decree here as it relates to, big pictures. We are for, smaller things. But I would hate to get to a point where someone says, you know what, you got it, you're good, you're in full compliance, and then now you're not because of a contract. So what are the conversations that are being had on the front end? So we're not solely focused on management rights and labor rights. How are we now changing the narrative to say, look, this is a new era of policing, period, point blank. How are we involving community in our considerations? And again, we might not always agree, but how are we making sure that we're negotiating all of the things that should be covered on the front end so that on the back end, someone doesn't turn around and say, or, again, there's protests, there's demonstrators, there are activists that are saying these processes need to be more transparent. There needs to be opportunity for more community involvement or for community input. Where are we having those conversations so that it's consistent across the country for those who do have CBAs, so that we're not having to go back and change things on the back end, so that there's more inclusion and involvement on the front end? I think that's the conversation that needs to be had around this right now today.
Okay.
To the point that, I'm sorry, but to the point that Danielle and Lynn have just mentioned, I can't really get into some of the things here in Chicago because we are still negotiating our contract. They just settled the financial aspect of it for the pay raises, but the remaining of the contract is still in negotiation. So I can't really get into what should or shouldn't be a part of the contract or that. But every contract is an opportunity to make cultural changes within the department. It's an opportunity to reinvent the department, to reinvent how we do things, and to speak to some of what Danielle said, community input and involvement. There may be an opportunity for that, but I can't speak on that because of the current ongoing negotiations. But what I can speak to is that it should be looked at as an opportunity for everyone. It shouldn't be, as she said, it's not us versus them, but it is an opportunity, especially if you're trying to, like in the consent decree, to make systemic cultural change within the department and to move the department forward. It is a process. Some good things can come out of it, and we hope to have some of those, but I'll just leave it at that so that I don't, derail any current negotiations.
I think actually that raises the question for me, can you give us some examples where you think upfront the community involvement, ways in which community involvement could occur upfront? Because we have a lot of people who are calling for more citizen involvement, independent councils, oversight in terms of the police department. So talk a little bit about, are there any departments that are out there that are doing it well, or you've seen some examples of things you think might work?
Well, I would say, just that. I mean, you put it out there. I mean, traditionally, and I can't speak for the other folks on the call, but traditionally, negotiations are all closed doors. And it's what the city wants versus what labor wants, right? And, depending on where you are, some cities have processes where part of the process is open into the public. That's how it was in Portland. I don't really know how I feel about that. But, there are other opportunities as well during public hearings, whether it's hosted by council or by the city or whomever it is, to allow the public to come out and say, this is what I'm looking for in a contract. Now, at first, I know I'm the one that threw this out here for a discussion and as a suggestion, but when it was first introduced to me, I was like, well, what would the community really have to say about a contract, right? But we forget who pays us. We forget from where we get our authority. They're our stakeholders. They're one of our very key stakeholders. So I would just say on the front end, if nothing else, at a very bare minimum, providing a venue for people to be heard, regardless of what, if folks really recognize that what they're asking for is something that's negotiable or not, right? If it's a CBA issue or not, just giving them the opportunity to be heard where we're not constantly telling them, nope, can't do that, nope, can't do that. I think that's a good starting point.
Okay. So we have Kim Gardner, who is also joining us. We'll give her the opportunity to introduce herself at this time, and we will continue. And I don't know, Ken, if you want to have a follow-up to Chief Commissioner Outlaw's comments. But let's have Kim Gardner join us. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kim Gardner. I'm the Circuit Attorney for the City of St. Louis. I'm considered the DA or prosecutor in other jurisdictions. I look forward to being on this panel. Just want to say this is a very interesting conversation, seeing that I'm the only prosecutor on this panel. So it's very interesting, but I think that it's needed. I think Commissioner Outlaw, as well as the other superintendent of Chicago, have outlined some of the challenges that in St. Louis City, because I'm unique, I'm a county within a county. So that means that my county in St. Louis is different from the city of St. Louis. That means we have a different St. Louis Police Officer Association in my city versus the county. And in the police department, we actually have two units where we have the Ethical Society of Police, which that is made up of Black police officers. And we have some history to why that's going on in our police department, as well as the St. Louis Police Officer Association. We also have never been under a consent decree in the city of St. Louis. So I don't know the world of a consent decree or the challenges. But what I do know is that you have well-meaning police commissioners like the ones that we have on this panel that need to do their job. And the collective bargaining agreement has been, in some instances, an impediment to reforming and doing their job the way that they need to do it. So one, build trust in the community to better serve the communities in which they represent. But the unique thing about it is they're not elected. So as you heard Commissioner Allah talk about, she has experiences with Seattle, and they have a public piece to their collecting bargaining process. In the city of St. Louis, it's behind closed doors. Even the prosecutor does not know about the terms of the collecting bargaining agreement. It's usually under the mayor and the public safety director that the mayor appoints, who is elected, and they have these closed sessions. And I believe that that is a problem, not only for the police chiefs and commissioners that are charged with leading these units, but we have to understand those collective bargaining agreements actually affect and impede a prosecutor's job like myself, who's elected. And if we're all about public safety and to hold, hold everyone accountable, we have to understand that sometimes these collective bargaining agreements make it difficult to actually, hold bad actors accountable. And that's inside of police departments and actually in many different things that affect my job. And so I think that this is a very complex problem. I don't think there's a one size fits all solution, but I believe we have to have people on all sides, even on this panel, who may not agree how we go about doing things, to have very frank conversations about the time we're in. We're in a time where people are not trusting law enforcement, and that's all law enforcement. That's not just the police, the fine men and women that police the communities, but actually the prosecutor's office. And if we're going to engender trust and be about public safety, we have to come together, because everybody thinks it's the George Floyd situations that we're dealing with, right? Those big things that we talk about and see in the media, actually it's the everyday slights of injustice that how some engage our communities that not only need police the most, but people in my community, in the city of St. Louis, that has been hampered with violent crime, they want police officers and people in the criminal justice system to respect them and build that trust so they can call us when something happens. And we can hold that violent perpetrator accountable. And those are the challenges that I see with some of the collective bargaining agreements.
So, Mr. Lucci, I'm going to put you on the spot here and could you speak from the side of the officers who are being protected by the collective bargaining? I'm going to ask you to give that perspective, because we hear the perspective, we've heard it of the prosecutor, we hear the police commissioners basically saying they need some leeway to be able to make changes. We need a process that includes the community. We need the ability, even under consent decrees, to be able to make changes and have them understand.
Can I say one more thing? Can I just say one more thing?
Yes, ma'am.
And I want to put this out here. So why this is important to me to be on this panel, one of the things that we need to actually be real, in the city of St. Louis and other parts, we have something called the Plainview Project, right? And most of these commissioners inherit some of these issues with the Plainview Project. We have people who are putting out homophobic, sexist, xenophobic sentiments against certain groups. And when you have police chiefs that inherit these things, right? And we have to do something with engendering trust in all of our communities. When you have something like that, how do we respond when a lot of collective bargaining agreements make it difficult for these well-meaning chiefs and commissioners around the country to hold people accountable that actually could be a problem and actually cause more lawsuits to the city and make it difficult for all of our jobs? So I think this is an important conversation, but I think we need to not be about whether we're against unions, we're against the collective bargaining agreement. But to me, most police officers I know, and by the way, I know people know me as the anti-law enforcement prosecutor. I'm not. I actually love and support police officers. I wouldn't be in this job if I didn't. But it's sad when you have police officers in my jurisdiction who are afraid to actually step up and come forward, because they have more abuse inside the police departments that are supposed to support them, and by police unions that also isolate them. We look at Luther Hall case right in the city of St. Louis, where we have police officers who were basically beating a unarmed police officer in one of the well-known protests in the city of St. Louis. And then we have the racial animus where they're texting racial statements that say that we have the plate lip in prosecutor, me, I guess I'm the plate lip, I'm gonna be real. And basically we have racial text between police officers going back and forth in the department. And that's looked upon like, oh, that's just one small situation. That's a problem. And the collective bargaining agreement makes it easy to keep those individuals, regardless of what you want to say, on the police department.
Let me say a few things. One is, I think it is good to have a little more transparency and public input into the collective bargaining process at the outset, to know what it is the public's interests are, and to get that for both sides to see that. But I also know you're not going to hammer out an agreement in full public view. It's even hard sometimes to hammer out an agreement in the negotiating room. I mean, there have been times that I've been standing up, and the lead negotiator from the other side has just been standing up, and we're shouting at each other, and we take a break, and the two of us walk out in the hallway, and we come back, and we've worked out an agreement. But I think you need to have that input at the front end on that. I also know, I mean, having been on both sides, I've also seen local governments really hardball it to get reforms in the disciplinary process. And to public safety officers, the most important thing that they're going to negotiate really are the wages and benefits. And so, you know, there have been times that the disciplinary process can be reformed because the primary interest is, what are you going to take home to the family? And the other thing I want to say on this is that technology has redefined when you are on duty and when you are off duty. And police officers, you could argue, are on duty 24/7, because if they witness a crime, they have to respond and intervene. And with social media, when they put things on social media, what they're doing reflects upon the department which they serve. And so it's changed. It's changed from when we used to say, no, that's my private time, that's my private conduct. And that line has gotten greatly blurred. And I think that's got to be figured out, but I think it's got to be figured out on the side of that you are on duty and reflect your department round the clock.
Okay, I think that you brought up some key points here with collective bargaining upfront, transparency. We really want a process that allows the community to become a part of it, at least have its say, or its concerns are expressed, and some way to make that a part of the process, to make sure that they're heard. And one of the things I think I heard you say, Attorney Lucci, was this issue of wages can be one of those ways that you hold back some of the things that you need in terms of bringing them to the table on the give and take. So we do know there's that give and take there. I want to move on a little bit, because I did hear Ms. Gardner talk about prosecution and the difficulty that she has. In some ways that the collective bargaining agreements prevent that. But could you talk to us a little bit about what do you face when prosecuting police officers? So maybe we can get a little bit more in terms of that, of how these agreements may or may not prevent you from being able to be prosecute those. And just want to say for everyone, because I know there are many officers who are participating here, this is not to say that every officer is in fact a bad officer. We want to make sure that those who are in fact not moving in accordance with the community norm, that they are basically taken care of. And so Attorney Gardner, Prosecutor Gardner, if you could just talk a little bit about what those challenges are.
Well, I just want to, of course, I hate to lead with this, but I just want to really say I thank Noble and the work and everyone on this panel have done in their respective communities. I know you guys are on the forefront of having these conversations to push the agenda of fairness and justice for all forward. But one of the things and the challenges as a prosecutor in my jurisdiction, the challenges in these cases, of course, is the accountability. It's very difficult. And I always like to use this hypothetical. We like hypotheticals as lawyers. And then when people were in law school, and I use this hypothetical to basically say, let's imagine where we have an individual that we want to hold accountable, right? and they're able to have their friends or people they know investigate them and turn whatever that investigation is over to a prosecutor. And I always tell people, what kind of investigation do you really think that prosecutor would have? Now, I understand the challenges with the law. I believe in rights of prosecutors, but we also have to understand the challenges that our job is to seek the truth and to pursue justice. And that means we have to start with an appropriate investigation that is appropriate for us to make whatever decision we're going to make. But what I found is when police departments in my jurisdiction, I can only speak to the city of St. Louis, when we do not have the ability to actually have an independent investigative body made up of police officers that actually want to seek the truth, what we find is that, there's a lot of impediments to a fair investigation, and it takes us time to actually look at this case and to make decisions. And in the city of St. Louis, we have more open officer-involved shooting cases that I inherited more than any, but when I got into office in 2017, we had one every 2.5 weeks officer-involved shooting case, and that's a problem. And I believe that the collective bargaining agreements as well as the special orders were directed, and actually we had in a case, the Jason Stockley case, it was actually stated in that case, because of this case, they made special orders and special provisions to have certain sleep cycles where the individual officer that's involved in an officer-involved shooting case is immediately able to get 72 hours, a 48-hour sleep cycle. They have certain procedures where the police union lawyer is on the scene before the prosecutor's office, which is a problem. And I believe that officers who are under investigation should have, they have a rights. I understand that, but they should be treated like any other person. And I think that we have to do a better job of making that investigation independent if we want the public and the community, as well as people in the police department, to actually have, one, accountability to the public, as well as trust in what we're doing. And I think that we have to have, that's why I always pose a public integrity unit where we have independent officers that report directly to the circuit attorney's office or the DA and other jurisdictions, where they have the ability to control the scene with other officers in the police department. Because I know we can't totally get rid of the independent local police department, but we have to seek the truth. And that it starts with that independent investigation. But that's been a problem with the collective bargaining agreements that are basically silent to us. They don't have to tell us about the agreement, as well as the inner workings of the police department, that they say the prosecutor's office is the black box. I say the police departments in the city of St. Louis is a black box, because navigating that world is a whole nother entity within itself. And so it puts a challenge to us because families are suffering. They're saying, why can't you close this case? And I basically cannot close a case because I know the investigation is very limited. If I show people the actual police reports in some of these incidences, it's actually not even to the level what I'm used to seeing in any other type of case. And I think it puts a disservice not only of the community, but actually the police officer who is under the investigation. And we have to do better, but we have to have real conversations about how we hold everyone accountable and actually provide the right information so we can hold an officer accountable or not. But I think in the end, we have to be transparent and accountable, but we have to have real conversations. Police departments should not be investigating themselves. We should have an independent body made up of experienced officers that report directly to the circuit attorney, because this is a criminal case. We have issues in terms of Garrity. We know the internal affairs, that should be separate from the actual officer involved shooting case. But what I've seen in some jurisdictions, not these because I don't know their jurisdiction, I've seen them morph the internal affairs and all these type of procedures into the criminal investigation. And that's a problem. It makes it very complex to navigate, and it makes it very difficult for a prosecutor.
Can I hop in and ask a question?
Yes, go right ahead.
So it's answering a question that I'm seeing, but then also asking a question of Attorney Gardner. And I know I'm going to get an honest answer because that's who she is. And this is our safe place, right? These are our go-to people. We can ask our questions, and regardless of what side of the table that we sit on. So before I get into the question, I see that one of the questions is, are basically do CBAs or will CBAs hinder the desired outcomes of criminal justice reforms? And then I think you'll see how this leads into the question that I have for Attorney Gardner. I really think it depends on leadership, right? Just because we ask for what we're asking for at the table, again, it's up to the arbitrator to determine whether or not it's actually awarded or ultimately placed in this collective bargaining agreement. With that said, before the civil unrest happened last summer, I already had a plan. I was brought in not only to address violent crime, as we all are as chiefs, superintendents, commissioners, regardless of our title, but I was also brought in as a change agent. And I happen to have somewhat of a background in reform and accountability. So I already knew and laid out in a plan, an action plan, the things that I wanted to get done over the next few years. But I also added a column in this plan, in this action plan, saying, these are the things that have contractual implications. So I knew when it came time for negotiations, I'd have to put those things on the table as a proposal. With that said, the proposals that I knew had contractual implications, I didn't just make up in my mind or because of my experience or my background, that was part of it, but it was also through community input and what people wanted to see. So a lot of our proposals, again, without going into the weeds, centered around transfer policies, disciplinary changes or reform, and our entire process, who we can move and where, so on and so forth. And then also having some modifications or requesting modifications to the arbitration process. And it's not just, what's being asked for here, but in other places around the country with community members recognizing, hey, when we make a decision as a leader of an organization, an arbitrator can come and overturn it. So a lot of people are asking, hey, Mr. or Ms. Arbitrator, ma'am or sir, if you agree that this behavior occurred, can you not change what the discipline is, please? So ultimately what I'm saying is, if you agree, if I terminate someone for X, Y, and Z, the arbitrator agrees that X, Y, and Z occurred, that they wouldn't be able to say, well, you know what, we think termination's a bit much. Let's split the baby and give you, you've been off on restricted duty long enough, 30 days. We know how that erodes public trust, right? And these are the sorts of suggestions and recommendations that have been made in these public forums. So as a new leader, right, that's beyond well-intentioned. I brought these things to the table, and that's what we're doing as leadership. So the answer is, I don't think a CBA or a collective bargaining agreement can hinder desired outcomes, but there are some roadblocks that can be in there because there are a lot of steps in the process, and there are a lot of outside entities that have final say in this, right? But my question for Attorney Gardner is, at what point does the DA's involvement become too much? Here's why I ask. My job is to ensure accountability, and I know these seats change, right? But if we have the proper systems of accountability in place and they work the way they're supposed to work, we're going to identify those folks that no longer need to be here, or, need a timeout, need some counseling, some training, or whatever it is. That's my role, right? And then if we identify that there's a criminal matter associated with whatever the misconduct is, then we turn that over to you, because we have a process in place that automatically rings the bell, whether somebody's testifying in court untruthfully or evidence is suppressed or whatever it is. There's a process in place to where that's now turned over to the district attorney's office for consideration of whether or not there's going to be a criminal case, right? My question is, at what point does DA involvement become too much to where it not only erodes the trust between the community and all of law enforcement, because there's now like, hey, we're all dealing with violent crime, when are you going to focus on that as well? But then also, when does it become too much in the sense that now we're really, really, really eroding morale internally within the department? Because whether it's true or not, and I know your position, right? I know how you roll. There's always going to be narratives about us. But now the narrative has become, the DA is only concerned about going after cops and nothing else. So now morale is low. And then now you have people, because we're human beings, saying, well, you know what, I'm really reticent about doing the things that my leadership over here for the people that I work for are asking me to do out of fear of either getting arrested or, and we know how these narratives can be exaggerated. Some folks, you know, they know better. And I say, get out of your own way. But I tend to say that the department caught these folks and we turned the case over to the DA's office. So where is there a fine line? Is too much on one side or the other? How do we strike that balance? And when does the DA's office need to step in to handle accountability versus thinking, okay, well, my job is this and police accountability? Or is there a demarcation?
I think that, I mean, accountability is accountability, regardless of whether your job is a police officer or a John Q. citizen. If you are committing a crime in the community, you're held accountable like anyone else. And I think that's where I understand what you're saying, but you know, I know the work that you've done, you've been in a jurisdiction that's light years ahead of the city of St. Louis. You know, in our history, we were controlled by the state. I think we were this Kansas City, Missouri, as well as the city of St. Louis were the only two police departments that were state controlled. And recently, the city of St. Louis, maybe about 7 years ago or 8 years ago now, is locally controlled. So we, even in 7 to 8 years ago, right now, are in a new kind of accountability with the local process that we've never been in. And so what we are dealing with is this finding that ground in terms of the local control piece to do those processes that you talk about, because that's been an issue for the new mayor in terms of, you know, how police are held accountable and this arbitration they go through as civil servants. That's a big thing. They are right now in a battle with the collective bargaining agreement that was being negotiated by the last mayor that stopped. But right now, I don't know if it's still going on or what's going on. I think right now it's stalled. So you're talking about your light years ahead of our jurisdiction. Right now, I believe that I'm accountable for what I do. And so I never try to get into the day-to-day, you know, dealings of the police department in the city of St. Louis. The commissioner of the city of St. Louis, I let them deal with the employment situations. What I deal with in terms of accountability is when a police officer has shown not to be credible or they're under an investigation. We had an issue where police officers were bringing cases. And so I created what's called an exclusion list, where those are individual officers based off of the things that we talk about, credibility, under investigation, or they're not truthful like any other witness. We choose not to let them entertain cases to our office. But that's where I have the discretion of how I do my job, because actually we have an ethical responsibility to have individuals who are trustworthy, who have the ability to take someone's life and liberty, to actually have a truthful police report so we can entertain appropriate charges for an individual to hold them accountable. When there's issues like that, we've made those decisions in very small incidences that most people in my area will say, she has everybody on the exclusion list. No, we don't. There's 1,500 police officers about in the city of St. Louis, about 1,300, less than 1% are on the exclusion list. And that's not, I don't have nothing to do with firing or what happens to that person. They just can't come to my office and entertain a potential charge because of the issues that they have. And we give them notice. We talk to the police department, the chief, and it's up for the chief to determine what they do. I never get involved in that day-to-day employment situation. And so I think I understand what you're saying, because I don't want to deal with the day-to-day employment situation of the police department. And the chief has told me it's difficult in some instances when they do identify the individuals that they need to do something with, because we don't know every situation. It's been a process that is basically, when they go through the civil service process, it actually can go against what the police chief wanted. So I know that's very complex, but those are things that I leave for the police chief in the city of St. Louis. I never interject myself, but what I do believe, we have to have an open communication when there's individuals that there's criminal, conduct that they need to investigate, that needs to be turned over. And by the way, never before I took this office was there a actual process of turning over those cases to the circuit attorney's office. It's been kind of hidden in internal affairs, and we never had any idea what was going on until there was a big civil judgment. And that's where the last prosecutor was saying no one was communicating with the DA's office in our jurisdiction. So right now, under myself and with this commissioner, police commissioner we've been having more kind of notification of issues that we need to deal with. And they've been turning over things that they've never been turned over before. But I think that's coming from the pressure of internal officers who want to see the bad actors being dealt with, as well as the community outcry for, you know, we need trust in the police department, because people in the communities that I love and I know that want police, that people try to say that because we have violent crime because of historically poverty and disinvestment, they want to see police policing appropriately. So they want police presence, but they want the right police presence. And so I think that, you know, everybody supports police, but they support fairness. And I understand what you're saying. I don't believe we should be injecting ourselves, but I think there is an accountability that we have to investigate criminal activity. And I believe if you have a police department, and historically in my jurisdiction, those incidences have never been turned over. And that's a problem, because in the end, you have individuals that are causing more havoc and actually tearing down the integrity of not just the police department, but the integrity of the criminal justice system. When I try a case and I have an officer that has a history of all kind of stuff, what's going to happen to that when we have to hold that violent offender accountable? It's a problem. And so it affects all of us. It's not just the individual day-to-day decisions of the commissioner or the employer-employee situation. It's people who look to me and say, Kim Gardner, this person is preying on us, but they're more afraid of the police officer testifying, and they scrutinize the police officer versus the actual perpetrator. I have a problem with that. And that's an issue in the city of St. Louis that we've been dealing with.
Prosecutor Gardner, we thank you, and we're going to transition. I see there's one question from the audience. You know, you have elected officials, the mayors, the governors, the city managers who are designated to represent government. They're elected by the folk, by the people, or appointed by to have trust. How do we, what responsibilities do the appointed elected officials have to communities they represent when negotiating CBAs?
You mean the mayors? I think they're important because they're in my jurisdiction. They are the ones that actually appoint the person and are part of negotiating the collective bargaining agreement. So I think they're responsible, but I think they're also responsible of giving public notice to the community with the collective bargaining agreements. I believe that there should be some community input, but I don't believe it should be driven solely by community. I think it should be law enforcement input. I think it should even be prosecutor input, just to say, hey, these are some of the challenges that we face. I think it should be the whole criminal justice ecosystem input into some of these things. Not saying we can negotiate them, but to give suggestions. So I would think it's important for elected officials to actually inform the public of what's going on inside these actual collective bargaining agreements. And I think it's the mayor's job, or whoever who's charged with that.
Anybody else want to make comment about that before we transition?
Sure. When I was the county labor negotiator, I had to report directly to the county executive. I had to give reports to the county council and the county legislature. And so, and they're answerable to the public. So definitely the public's interests were involved when we put proposals on the table. Likewise, when I represented the Fraternal Order Police, they had town meetings as well about getting public input into policing. So I think the more collaborative approach, the better. One more comment I wanted to make, and that is, Attorney Gardner, you're talking about collaboration and coordination between the police commissioner and the prosecutor. It also needs to be done with the civil attorney as well, because I found when I became county attorney that the internal affairs didn't know about civil lawsuits and how many officers were sued, and our office did not know about civilian complaints against officers through the administrative process. And so we both had information that was helpful to each other. And so really all three groups need to collaborate and coordinate to make sure that there's accountability.
Can I just say this one thing, because I want to articulate this in the city of St. Louis. That is a great, you know, I strive to with Commissioner Outlaw and what's going on with everybody else, but I'm sorry, in the city of St. Louis, and I love my city, but it's just not like the city council's office, the police union and other people. Actually, the Civilian Oversight Board is under the public safety director, which is under the mayor and so they know more about what's going on than I do. And that's a problem. And I believe that civilian review board should not be under the public safety director or the police department. I think it should be a separate entity, as we know. I know that's one of the questions we probably are not going to get to, but I think that we have to understand where each jurisdiction is. And that's the problem with the collective bargaining agreements and the conversation me and, Commissioner Outlaw is having. What she has, I wish she was in St. Louis, because I'm like, what, really? You do all that? I mean, that's like amazing. I'm like, whoa, did that actually happen? But I'm not even commenting on my commissioner, but that's the thing. You would think that Commissioner Outlaw, based on her jurisdiction and what she's done, it's totally different from the city of St. Louis, but that's the hamstring of what the police commissioner in my jurisdiction has. And to be honest with you, it's basically leading the ship with your eyes blinded, your hands tied behind your back, and then you're saying lead everybody and do everything. It's a tough job, and I want to say whoever becomes the police commissioner in the city of St. Louis, they have a lot of work, but it's decades of this one-sided approach that we've had that is no accountability, and that's the problem.
Okay, I'm going to transition to another question. We probably have maybe about 15 minutes left before we open it up to the chat and try to wrap this up at 5 o'clock. So someone brought up the issue of independent counsels. Should there be an independent counsel made up of citizens from the community to look at cases involving the use of force? And should this counsel be able to recommend training, discipline, or removal from the police force? And I know that in some jurisdictions, there may be some forms of these in different ways. I'm not sure in your communities how you address this, but could you speak to this at all? I'm going to ask Deputy First Superintendent Carter to talk about how this is handled in the city of Chicago.
Currently here in the city of Chicago, we just got a brand new civilian oversight committee. City ordinance just came through about 2 weeks ago for it. It's newly formed. It hasn't actually taken shape with the assignment of or the appointment of personnel as of yet. We're still waiting to see what that's going to look like and what exactly it will entail. Right now, we currently have a police board. So our police board oversees all dismissal cases or firings on the city of Chicago. The superintendent can recommend for an officer to be fired, and the police board can either agree or disagree. And the same token, the police board can recommend the firing of a police officer, and the superintendent can disagree. And at some point, the police board has final say. They can either agree with the superintendent or not. So that's what we're currently under. But we've just added under city ordinance a civilian oversight committee that is supposed to oversee that. So like I said, we really haven't gotten a chance to see how that's going to work with the police board, but that is something brand new. The members of that commission will be appointed by the mayor for the first term, but they can serve up to 12 years to be elected every 4 years for a maximum of 12 years. So it's new. It hasn't been put in, but it's something to think about and consider. To see who has the final say right now is still currently the police board for a final say for discipline or dismissal from within the department at a certain level.
Okay. Commissioner Outlaw, comments?
Yeah, civilian oversight. I would just say that civilian oversight is a part of contemporary policing. Legislation passed here in Philadelphia where an overwhelming percentage of voters here voted for a form of civilian oversight. So it's wanted. And then I came from 2 places that had civilian oversight. So I've been working in that world for quite some time. Now, I do think, however, as we roll out what civilian oversight looks like here, I think there needs to be very clear parameters and guidelines. Depending on where you are, I mean, go back to my home agency, the police chief before the sitting chief now was fired because of the oversight boards. I mean, technically there were, almost a handful of entities that could terminate the police chief. So I just really think there needs to be some guardrails, some very clear expectations set. And then I would ask the question, are there other places in your processes, maybe where you can bring civilian oversight in, whether through a civilian position that sits on the disciplinary board or something else? Are there other ways to get to yes? Right. Okay. I think that's the question that would need to be asked, because I definitely think, because I've seen some places can take it too far, but civilian oversight is definitely a very important factor in 21st century policing.
Okay, Mr. Lucci, and then I think there's a question in the chat. So comments?
I actually negotiated a civilian oversight process that's ended up a board 30 years ago, where this oversight panel reviews all internal affairs investigations and gives comments on it to the police chief. That's worked well. What I think is not good is when the police chief does not get to have the responsibility of making final disciplinary decisions about that chief's own officers. I think the chief is the one who's accountable to the elected officials, and the chief needs to be the one to make those decisions. One thing that the Maryland legislature did this past year is they set up an office in the Office of the Attorney General to investigate all police involved contact shootings, so that there'd be an independent agency investigating those. And I will see how that works, but I understand the reason for that.
Okay. The question we have in the chat is, has the usage of police boards reduced arbitration or the overturning of discipline? Do you have any sense of that? Those of you who are familiar with it?
As for the city of Chicago right now, under previous administrations, and I can only go, and I don't want to be, can't say the percentage exactly, but at one point under former Superintendent McCarthy's term, he designated that 75% of the discipline cases that he recommended for firing were overturned by the police board. And the police board is civilian oversight, but we've just added a second civilian oversight on top of that. Our superintendent doesn't have final say on the firing of a police officer. He can recommend it, but the police board can't overturn or agree with it. So that it's a delicate process here within the city of Chicago on how those final cases are determined. Can't say that arbitration has done a significant job with it here, but the police board does control the final say and outcome and what happens to them.
Okay. I want to transition to our last question for probably about 10 minutes or so. And this is one that we've heard some conversation on and some opinions about. And it's around the issue of what processes should be implemented to ensure that sworn officers with misconduct issues not get hired by another law enforcement agency. And should we have a national public searchable database of law enforcement officers who previously engaged in inappropriate use of force or discrimination?
I'll jump in on that one.
I was gonna say, great way to end, right?
Yeah, I mean, so in the state of Oregon, where I left, I was there for 2 years. There is a certification process that they have in place. So depending on what you were disciplined for, what the sustained finding was for, or if you were terminated, these cases all over the state then go to a board through the training. It's called DPSST. I mean, I sat on the board and I'm just trying to remember what the acronym stands for. Long story short, there is a panel there that decides whether or not someone should lose their certification in the state of Oregon. And then that way, you can't go be a cop anywhere else. But that varies from state to state. I know that every state doesn't have that, right? So in the meantime, going back to the conversations about systems of accountability, I think that's why it's so important to have very strong systems in place to identify smoke before there's fire, to identify what's really, really good, the behaviors that you want to replicate, to be able to hone in at the individual level, to find any repeated patterns, all the way through the system, all the way through the organization, right? Having a system in place, whether you want to call it an early intervention system or early warning system, key policies that align with that, and then, a disciplinary guide or something that aligns with the values of the department so that people are, being disciplined in proportion to whatever their misconduct was. So I think these systems are very important to have if you don't have, the ability to lose a certification. And then we all know, I had to have a very thorough background investigation when I came here as commissioner, and a very thorough background investigation when I took over as chief in Portland, Oregon. And then, of course, we all know the background investigation that we have when we're first hired as police officers. We sign a waiver that says you can have access to whatever information it is about me, whatever comes up, here it is, right? They don't get to say, no, that's confidential. So even if, you're in a state that, again, doesn't allow you to lose your certification, if I know I'm in hot water over here, it's incumbent upon police agencies, when they get these requests for background investigations, to give everything. We all know that there's some departments out there that just want to pass the problem along. You got to speak up and say something. And then it's, we got to have good training for our background investigators to ask those probing questions as well. So there's ways to not re-inherit problem officers. We just have to utilize the systems that's available to us, ask the tough questions, and not just take things at face value, because there is nothing worse than inheriting a problem from another agency, because now the microphone is shoved in my face as the new commissioner, and I'm being held accountable for somebody's actions that I didn't even know about, that I didn't even have. So I think, again, there's ways to do that. As it relates to whether or not there should be a national database, I think the answer is yes to that, but again, with parameters. There's been a lot of conversation and narrative around just throwing everything out there, making everything public. Due process is due process for a reason. We know that people can make complaints about anything under the sun. And just because it's alleged doesn't necessarily mean that it's founded. So if we're talking about, certain cases that have to do with moral turpitude, lying or stealing or, whatever that is, or excessive use of force, I would be in agreement with making that information public if it's upheld, if it's a sustained finding. But if somebody just came out and said, yeah, they did it, I don't think that should be made public. It makes our jobs very difficult. It can undermine our credibility and authority. And then ultimately down the road, we find out that it's not true. You can't unring the bell when that information's already put out there publicly.
Okay. Mr. Lucci, I thought you were trying to jump in on that question, so join us.
Thank you. I think there needs to be a searchable database of police officers, disciplinary, civil, and criminal records that is accessible to other law enforcement agencies. I'm not quite sure I'm there yet that needs to be public, but I do think we need to protect agencies against officers that go from department to department to maybe resign in lieu of firing, or have disciplinary records that other agencies don't have access to, or they can't find, or that they agree that it would be sealed. Agencies need to know who they're hiring, and not just within a state. I mean, we have many officers from Maryland who migrate to Florida when they get to a certain point in their career, and Florida agencies don't have that same kind of access that they need to the Maryland records. And so that would be very helpful. But I agree with Commissioner Outlaw that this could be harmful to officers if everything was made public, including non-sustained complaints.
Okay. Ms. Gardner, do you have any comments regarding that?
Yeah, I'm gonna, it's hard to agree, but I'm gonna say in two parts. The first, I do agree that we should have a searchable database, just like I believe when people get run and we see as employers, arrest of people. You can get arrested and someone can put that arrest on you, but that does not mean that arrest turns to be a conviction or something. other than an arrest. Well, I believe in police officers' case, we need a federal database that law enforcement personnel can, one, report from the police commissioner's perspective to whether they had certain instances that should be in this reportable database with guidelines like Commissioner Allah is talking about. But I think it should also, go into, as you heard the first deputy superintendent saying that in some cases, a commissioner who should know whether this person, I'm not saying the commissioner may always be right, I don't know, but they should know if they're seeking termination, that's serious, right? So I believe those types of determinations should be put in the database, regardless of whether this independent body, police commissioners sustain it or not. Because I think that individual employer or other law enforcement agency needs to have every available information accessible so they can make a determination based on their experience and skills if this person is fit to be in their police department. So I believe it should be a very extensive list that is for certain personnel, but I also think just like we have data of stops that the Attorney General maintains in states and jurisdictions, we actually need to have complaints of officers and how many issues of certain categories that should be made public. So I think there's ways to do both, but I think we have to have everyone come to the table and articulate what we need, because I understand that we have to give people due process, but I have issues where I know people in the community have been arrested for many different things. And when you look at their arrest, I have to decipher whether this person, based off an arrest, or we have people blanket with a lot of arrests, but they still are able to be hired. But I have certain information, and that information may not always be true. And we know that some jurisdictions, like in my jurisdiction, blanket certain communities with certain arrests. And when you dive into those things, you find, okay, nothing came about this. And I think that we have to have the ability to do our due diligence as law enforcement to hire someone. But I think right now, the time, if we want to build trustworthiness and credibility for the community, you guys know, you know, where I see people in the chat saying about the unions. Well, guess what? Everybody knows Kim Gardner and know my business. So why is this other people, the police departments, are they secret from some of the things they're doing? Don't sign up for this job if you're not signing up to be scrutinized. You have the ability to take someone's life and liberty. So that comes with a burden, and that comes with some extra responsibility. So, hey, deal with it. Like, I have to deal with it. I'm the most attacked, the most investigated, actually going through a lot of stuff, but I'm not going to sit here and not stand in here, because I believe in change. But with change and with this uncomfortableness of the situation we're in, is scrutiny. And I'm willing to sit there and lie in my scrutiny, regardless of whether you support Kim Gardner or not, or what she's doing, or other reform-minded prosecutors. But that's the job I signed up for. So as a police officer, you're going to be scrutinized. Deal with it.
Well, on that note, what I'd like to do is thank our panelists for a lively discussion today. I think that we've heard everything from use of police boards, transparency, how to get our community engaged in the collective bargaining process. I think that you've done an outstanding job, and we are better for it in terms of the positions that you hold, the communities that you represent. And thank you so much for being candid and real today with our audience. It's now time for the audience to ask a few questions, and then we'll close out with closing remarks from each of you. All right, Cynthia, do we have any questions? I can't see the audience, so. Okay, well, I think you've been so thorough. We've asked the questions as we've gone along. One of the last ones I'll ask is, how can Noble best support the work that you do?
I believe that Noble set the tone for the 21st century policing, where you got together. I think it's time now that we need to convene. Hopefully you guys agree to work with the Biden-Harris administration, that we have a former prosecutor. We have someone embedded in law enforcement to have a conversation and topics that we're talking about, to come up with a actual report that I think that is critical in this time right now. And Noble is the organization that actually led that conversation in 21st century policing.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in? How can Noble support you in your work?
Just as Noble is on a national front, on the local front, the local chapters of Noble, I know it's good to see them involved on a local front for what's happening locally within their jurisdictions. That actually is the quickest change agent within the local community department. If they're very active and vocal and verbal within the departments that they have chapters in, that really sets the tone not only for those police officers of color, but of the communities of color, for them to be a voice for them. So I really encourage Noble to the local chapters to really step up, stand up, and be heard in their local communities.
Yeah, I'd piggyback on what Eric said, in that, you know, Noble's mission has been what it is long before I was sitting in any leadership position. You know, 2021 is about action, and, you know, it is what it is. You know, I would say continue to do what Noble has done. But in addition to that, as we are seeing more and more of our colleagues sit in these hot seats, taking more leadership positions, speaking out vocally and publicly about social justice issues and, you know, reform and accountability, and taking positions that might not have been popular back in the day or even a year ago, I would just ask for continued support when we do have to put ourselves out there, you know, because it happens often where, you know, we stand at these podiums a lot by ourselves, but we're really looking to see who's standing behind us when we're making a lot of these decisions that need to be made. And, you know, Noble has been 100% supportive, not only of me, but of many of us. And I would just ask that we would continue to live by our mission.
Okay. Mr. Lucci, any comments from your perspective?
I just want to echo Kim's remarks, and that is we have a very open, experienced, and inclusive U.S. Department of Justice now, who want to hear your thoughts and comments through Noble and through the individual agencies. And I think get involved, engage with them, because they are very collaborative, they are very experienced, and their heart's in the right place.
All right. So at this point, what we will do is give each of you a moment to do a closing remarks. And I will say to the audience, thank you for joining us today. We have certainly had a lively discussion. And I'd say, I believe that our departments and the jurisdictions that you represent are in very, very good hands. And we look forward to the work that you will continue to do in your respective positions. So let's wrap it up. Who wants to start first?
I'll say that we here in Chicago and my colleagues around the country, we know that the police are the community, and the community are part of the police. We can't do our jobs without their support, as Danielle mentioned earlier. But we would ask, and I'll say this from my colleagues that here locally, a little more understanding and patience from what you see. The officers out here, they're doing a yeoman's job, but we're just a small part of the judicial system. It's that back end. If you look at most departments around the country, they are putting in the work. The officers are holding up their end. It's the back end where we need, and not to be on you, Ms. Gardner, but we need that prosecution all the way through the judicial system. We're facing a lot of challenges with new reforms that have been pushed through in light of COVID and George Floyd. But we're seeing we're doing our very best to ensure the public safety and to ensure that you have that trust in us. So anything that we can do as a department here in Chicago, but I'm sure nationally, we are willing to do to show our worth and show that we are committed to serving and protecting the public and building that community trust for the long term, not just for the short term, but for the long term. So please feel free to write, text, email me, whatever it is that you need to do. We listen here in Chicago just as around the country, and we will take your ideas and try and put them forth as best we can into our structure. Please be safe, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of the panel.
Thank you very much. I have Kim next in I'm going from the right to left. So Kim.
I want to say thank you to everybody on this panel. This is a very robust conversation. I appreciate it's very complex. But I want us to say is I think that we're all need to work together. I believe that we are in a time where we have community against police, community against the prosecutor, and we have to understand that there has been a historical mistrust of the criminal justice system, and the most forward-facing individuals are law enforcement. And I think that most police know that they do their job without fanfare or accolades, and they police the right way, but we only hear about the small few individuals that we see across the news. But we have to admit that there is an issue. I want to actually, send a challenge out to Noble, which I know you probably spoken out about this, but we have to actually speak about the insurrection issue that took place in our capital, that there are many law enforcement officers that participated, that even in my jurisdiction, I asked my local police department, what officers were a part of that, because that is also causing us challenges in terms of how we hold people accountable. But at the same time, we're on the same side, and justice means to pursue justice, not merely convictions. That means sometimes how we respond has to be appropriate, and how we actually rehabilitate and bring together all community stakeholders to address crime in our cities. And I believe that the tough on crime rhetoric that we like to fall back to is a failed approach. That is also a fear mongering of this hate and divide that we're experiencing right now that is causing challenges in Chicago and many other places that I know. But at the same time, we have to understand that there's people who want to see some prosecutors like myself, the Kims, I call Kim Fox and Kim Gardner, in Chicago and St. Louis, but see us fail because there's individuals who want to say that we don't want to hold violent offenders accountable, which is simply not true. And so while people have this rhetoric of tough on crime, but I say is beyond just being tough on crime. It's about the humanity of individuals and how you police and even how you prosecute with respect and dignity. That means you're not sacrificing safety, but at the same time, you understand the humanity in all people, regardless of whether you're a defendant, whether you're a police officer, whether you're a victim in the community. And as a prosecutor, we have a tough job that we don't represent an individual, we represent the whole system. And so I'll support the conversation, but I also support actually having individuals on here that the FOP, the national FOP, basically endorsed Trump and is silent about the insurrection. So until we address that, we can have conversations about fairness and justice, but, it's some people looking at this situation that there's a racial divisiveness that is embedded in police officers, police departments, not police officers, police departments around this country. And until we address that, we can have conversations and we can have policy, proposals, but we have to address the bigger elephant in the room, racial divide, and actually the Capitol Police that were called all kind of things, that people are committing suicide on the Capitol Police. And where's the support for them? So I support everybody to address that.
We have about 2 minutes left, and I believe our Zoom will shut down. So I'm going to say for Commissioner Outlaw and Mr. Lucci, if you would put your where someone could post information for you in the chat, we'll take that as that opportunity. And I'm sure that all of their bios are actually posted on the website. Again, I'd like to say thank you to you. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for your expertise. It's been great dialogue today. And I hope that we will take the tidbits and the recommendations that you've made, take them to heart in our local jurisdictions, our state legislatures, and also at the federal level. Thank you. And I think that's it. Georgia.
Be safe, everyone. Thank you.